All right, AP Environmental Science. Today, we're going to continue with Unit 8, topics 8.2 to 8.8. Again, we're going to spend a couple of days on these three. Take my mask off there. A few days on these three topics. So, the first day, I think yesterday actually, we spent some time talking about sediment, thermal pollution, and eutrophication. So we kind of went through these first three. Again, make sure you look over those, especially eutrophication. That's usually a really big AP test topic. Today we're going to focus on heavy metals. Now, again, just like with all of these different types of pollution, I kind of want us to focus on the causes. What are the sources of this type of pollution, and also the effects of it. Okay, so cause and effect. So let's start with heavy metals. Now, when it comes to heavy metals, there are a lot of them. Um, these five are the most common, but even amongst these five, lead, arsenic, mercury, cadmium, and copper, we're only going to look at the first three of them today. These are pretty much the ones that you'll probably get asked about on the AP test. So I'm going to kind of focus on lead, arsenic, and mercury. So let's go ahead and start off with lead today. So lead, as far as the source of it, how does it get into our water? The biggest source is corroding pipes. So, for example, you look at these old pipes here. These things might have been installed, back in the 1930s or something. They're close to being over 100 years old. But a lot of those old pipes contained lead, or they contain brass, which contains lead. And the bottom line is as those pipes get older and as they corrode, that lead can actually get into water. So, any of these old pipes should probably be replaced because of the possibility of lead contamination. Now, fetuses and infants, children, are the most susceptible to lead. And the reason why that is, and this is kind of the same for most of the heavy metals, is that most of these heavy metals affect the nervous system, especially the nervous system of a developing child. I'm not saying that they don't affect adults as well, but for children who have a developing nervous system, that can be very problematic. Um, Now, I will say this about lead. The use of lead and the possibility of it getting into water has really decreased quite a bit in our country in the last 30 years, and a lot of that has to do with the EPA, setting guidelines for construction. For example, we can't install pipes anymore or fittings on pipes that have lead in them. Water filtrations in our homes have gotten a lot better. Water treatment plants have gotten a lot better. So, lead in our water is something that you don't really hear a lot about anymore. However, there are still some communities and there's still some older homes that still may have pipes that are high risk for lead. Um, some of these communities where you see some of this stuff are usually poorer communities, usually low socioeconomic status. A really good example of this was a place called Flint, Michigan. And I'm going to guess, if you've been alive for the last 20 years, you may have heard of some environmental problems in the city of Flint, Michigan. So I do want to talk about them a little bit today because it is kind of a historical thing. I think this is something that people will be talking about for a long time. Now, what happened in Flint, Michigan was basically in 2015, the government of Flint and also the governor of Michigan decided to um, change water sources, for the city's drinking water. For a long time, the city of Flint got its water supply from the Detroit River. Detroit River is a little bit further away from Flint. Um, compared to another river, which is the Flint River, which is much closer to home. It's much closer to the city of Flint. Now, the reason why they were getting their water from the Detroit River for such a long time was mainly because the Flint River is a little bit dirtier. It takes a little bit more to clean the water before you can use it. But eventually, what they did, they switched back. They switched back to the Flint River instead of the Detroit River. So when they did this, the people who were in charge, they didn't really think about the possible consequences of changing the source of the city's water supply. So they didn't really do much. They're just like, we'll just switch the rivers. We'll switch where we get our water from. It's going to be a little bit cheaper to get it from the Flint River, so we're going to do that. And if there's any type of pollution, we'll just kind of worry about it, later on as it happens, instead of trying to figure out any potential problems that may have happened or that could have possibly have happened. So they did this. They went ahead and they changed river systems as far as where they got their water from. Now, immediately when they did this, the citizens of Flint started noticing some issues with their water. The smell of their water was kind of odd. The color of it was a little bit like strange, like kind of yellow. And what they found was that in their water, there was very high levels of bacteria. Okay, E. coli, it's called a fecal coliform bacteria. It usually is an indicator that there's human waste in the water. So basically, the Flint River was not a good source of drinking water for the people of Flint. So the city decided, okay, well, we'll clean this up for you. What we'll do is we'll just put chlorine in the water, which is how they treat a lot of water that has bacteria in it. They'll use chlorine, and in thinking that would be kind of a quick solution to the problem. Well, there's two problems when you use chlorine to treat water. One of those problems is that the chlorine can actually interact with some of the materials that are in the sewage that might be in the water, and they can form something called trihalomethanes, which are carcinogens. So, by using all of this chlorine in this, basically septic water, they actually increase the levels of these carcinogens in water. So that's kind of an issue, right? But the other problem is that when they use chlorine to treat the water, chlorine actually causes pipe corrosion. And in the city of Flint, there is a lot of old pipes that contain lead. So by treating their water with high levels of chlorine, what happened was is they increased the amount of lead corroding from the pipes into the city's water supply. So, for example, it says here water is found to contain lead levels of 13,000 parts per billion. Hazardous waste, like something that's labeled as hazardous waste, is anything above 5,000. So the city of Flint was actually drinking water that was basically three times the normal concentration of what hazardous waste would be. So that was a major issue. They were basically being poisoned, okay, with lead. Um, what happens again, when you start consuming lead, especially in children, was these their blood levels with lead continued to increase. So it started to bioaccumulate in their bodies. And it's much more serious in children than it is in adults, but adults were getting sick as well. So, they complained, and said, hey, our kids are getting sick, people are getting sick, people are losing their hair. So the government said, well, we'll just give you guys a bunch of free bottled water, and we'll give you some filters, that'll maybe help filter the lead out, which were like totally ineffective. And then they said, well, we'll just switch back to the Detroit River. We'll do that too. But in the meantime, a bunch of people got really sick. I'm not going to read every single thing here to you, but I mean, you can just look and see. I mean, this is what happens when children get lead into their bodies. I mean, there's kidney problems, blood problems, heart problems, brain problems, which is a really big one. All right, I mean, lots and lots of problems. So, I mean, Flint, Michigan, historically, I think is a really important lesson to learn, especially when it comes to matters of environmental injustice. Again, I go back to Flint, being one of the poorest cities in the world, and just the fact that this happened in that city. The fact that the government officials said we can just switch your drinking water and not even really worry about it until people start complaining. I mean, and just the response, by the government to all the problems that they had. I mean, would this ever have happened, in Crown Point? Would this ever happen in a more affluent community? I doubt it. But it happened in Flint. And I think it's a really good example, again, of environmental injustice. We see these environmental issues, and they seem to pop up in communities of color. They seem to pop up in communities of, again, of low socioeconomic status, people who don't have a lot of political clout. And that's a real issue that we have to, I think, kind of address. So, again, Flint, Michigan, make sure we know a little bit about that one. All right, arsenic. Arsenic, kind of like lead, can get into groundwater. It is a heavy metal. Arsenic is naturally found in the crust of the earth, and it can dissolve into groundwater if it comes in contact with groundwater. Now, usually that's very minimal, except when humans disrupt the land and they disrupt the Earth's crust, and it could cause high levels of arsenic to actually get into groundwater. Now, one of those ways is through mining. When we mine for things, we dig through the Earth's crust, we disrupt it, and that could put arsenic into groundwater supplies or maybe even surface water supplies. And there's also industrial uses of arsenic. Things like wood preservatives. A lot of wood preservatives actually have arsenic in them. And if those things, let's say, for example, some old furniture gets dumped in a landfill or something, the chemicals from that can actually get into water supplies. So, I think I would say mining is probably the biggest one, but anytime you disrupt the Earth's surface, or if you have anything on the surface that contains arsenic, it can get into water supplies. Now, arsenic can be pretty easily removed from water. We do have filters that can easily get rid of arsenic. We can distill water. We can use reverse osmosis systems. Some of these things are expensive. They're technologies, but we can use them to easily get rid of arsenic. The problem is in a lot of countries around the world, they don't have access to those technologies. The EPA has declared that if there's more than 10 micrograms per liter of arsenic in any body of water, that's considered to be unsafe. Even though that number for a lot of scientists seems to be really high, there's been a lot of talk about lowering that down to 5 micrograms per liter. But arsenic, if it gets into the body, can cause skin, lung cancers, kidney, and bladder cancers as well. Here's a map here of the U.S. showing us where there's some high deposits of arsenic. Again, look up here in Northwest Indiana. There's some higher than normal deposits of arsenic. So again, that's probably something that we should be somewhat concerned with. But again, we have some ways to treat our water for that. India and Bangladesh. Let's go back to Bangladesh. Again, one of the poorest countries in the world. The Ganges River, one of the most polluted rivers in the world. And again, because that river is so polluted with whatever, that means that they have to dig deeper in order to access groundwater so that they can drink from it. Well, when they dig these deeper wells, they actually dig through arsenic deposits, and that arsenic ends up getting into their water. And they actually had, I'd say probably, I think it was about 10 years ago, they had a case where thousands of people ended up getting arsenic poisoning because of the drinking water that was contaminated with arsenic. So, again, Bangladesh, poor Bangladesh. I mean, they have so many issues there with their water. Even when they try to drill and dig for deeper groundwater, that still ends up being problematic because there's so much arsenic in the area. So lots of issues there in Bangladesh. All right, finally, mercury. Mercury, again, can be found in water through the result of a lot of different things. I would say probably the number one way is burning fossil fuels. Now, when we burn fossil fuels, there's mercury in coal. So when all of that air pollution goes up into the air and it contains mercury, it actually can come back down to earth in the form of wet deposition. So all of that rain that comes down that has mercury in it, that's how it gets into the water. Two-thirds of all mercury produced from human activities comes from burning coal. This is the big one. There's some other things as well, burning garbage. This is a bigger problem in other countries. Medical and dental waste, manufacturing of cement, petroleum and fracking wells. One thing that's been a nice fix is the government regulations on the cement industry. Cement, producing cement actually does produce mercury, but because of government regulations, again, because of the EPA, we've reduced that by 81%. So that's a really good thing. But again, coal burning, that is a big culprit when it comes to mercury in the environment. Now, the one problem about mercury is inorganic mercury, just kind of like the element mercury, um, isn't necessarily that harmful. Um, However, when mercury gets into water, what happens is it ends up being converted into something called methyl mercury. Methyl mercury, this is the formula for it. You don't really have to memorize that, but methyl mercury it's an ion. It's a positive ion, and it can react with any negative ion, things like nitrates and sulfates and phosphates and whatever. But what happens is when mercury gets into water, bacteria can actually convert it into methyl mercury, and then it can become parts of a whole bunch of different compounds. And that's when it can actually get into fish. It can get into the food chain, and for people, that eat fish that are contaminated with methyl mercury, then that can get into our bodies. So we usually get it into our bodies through eating, again, contaminated fish, shellfish. There are some specific types of fish that have much higher levels of mercury than others. Tuna is one of those, especially albacore tuna, if you ever heard of that before. But basically, fish that are on the high level of the food chain. Tuna is a big fish. It's kind of like a tertiary consumer. In the ocean, sharks are tertiary consumers. Any of those types of fish that are high up on the food chain, they're going to have much higher concentrations of mercury in their body compared to possibly other fish. So, I want to. This I think is a good time to kind of take a look at a couple of terms that we've talked about before. The term bioaccumulation. Bioaccumulation basically refers to any substance, and heavy metals are one of these, that can just start building up in the tissues of the body. For example, mercury builds up in the fatty tissues of fish, and it doesn't leave. It's not like they can like urinate it out. It's just like it stays in their body. So we call that bioaccumulation. It just starts accumulating in the bodies of organisms. Now, when it starts moving up the food chain because of one fish eating another, and that fish eating another, that's what we call biomagnification. Okay, I think this picture here kind of is a pretty it's pretty good at showing us the difference between the two terms. For example, here we have a species of fish. Whatever, let's say this is a bluegill or something. That bluegill is just swimming in the water, but as it's swimming around, that, let's say it's methyl mercury, for example, it just starts building up in the body. Right? So we call that bioaccumulation. By the end of that fish's life, that fish may have a lot of mercury that it's accumulated in its body. But biomagnification is when that mercury makes its way up the food chain. You got to remember this about the food chain, right? These organisms on the lower end of the food chain, there's more of those organisms than there are organisms at the top of the chain. So let's say we have, for example, these four little insects, and maybe each one of them has a little bit of let's say mercury in their body. Well, the next level is these birds. There's only three of them though. So if those three birds eat all four of these whatever insects, then all of that mercury that was in those four insects is now in the bodies of these three birds. Well, those three birds now have all that mercury in them, and they're going to get eaten by these two snakes. So those two snakes now are accumulating all of that mercury from those three birds. And then we have this one, let's say, hawk or an eagle that's going to eat these two snakes. Well, all of that mercury is going to go into that eagle. So this is what we call biomagnification. It's where it gets transferred from one organism to the next. Bioaccumulation is just where it builds up in the tissues of one specific organism. All right, so make sure we use the proper term. Okay. Um, there's an interesting study that was done in 2008, by the New York Times. I just want to throw this in here just because I think it's kind of interesting. But there was 20 sushi restaurants in the city of New York that they tested um, mercury levels for in the sushi. And what they found out was that eating six pieces of tuna-based sushi from all 20 restaurants, that actually exceeded the EPA standard for safe human consumption of mercury. So that was an interesting study, and it really put the spotlight on tuna being eaten by humans that contains mercury, and it could be problematic. It could be poisonous. All right, now last couple things here. When it comes to heavy metals, I just want to make sure we understand this. We've talked about this before. We talked about acid rain, wet deposition. Anytime you're burning a fossil fuel, whatever. I mean, I'm not going to go through the process of acid rain again with you. If you want, you can look at a previous video. But when those acids reach the surface, right here is the part of this diagram that I really want you to focus on. But when those acids reach the surface, from acid rain, as they migrate through the soil, they actually can force metals in the soil to migrate. So if there's any lead or mercury or any type of heavy metal in the soil, those acids can actually dislodge those metals and carry them into bodies of water. So this is a concern. All right, there's a connection between acid rain and metals in the surface being moved into water. All right, so make sure we understand that. I also want to go back and just briefly reference this acid mine drainage. I talked about this back in our energy unit. All of these old abandoned mines, right, that have, oh, I don't know, water in them, and there's still minerals inside. One of those things we talked about was pyrite. Right? Pyrite is a common mineral that's found in a lot of abandoned mines. That pyrite can turn into sulfuric acid when it reacts with water. So, in a lot of abandoned mines, we have a lot of sulfuric acid. Well, if this acid, for whatever reason, if it ends up leaking out of the mine, which it does from time to time, again, it can free up all of those heavy metals in the soil and it can carry them with it into a body of water. So I want us to understand a little bit about acid mine drainage. how it's caused, that we talked about before, but what are the results of that? This is another way that heavy metals can actually get into a water supply. So AMD, acid mine drainage. All right, guys, that's it for today. I'll see you soon. Have a good day. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email if you need to. Take care, everybody.